I'd like to introduce my amazing panel. You guys are amazing. So first we have Kathy Biles. She is from OSU Cascades, the Master's in Counseling, School Counseling Program Coordinator. And while working as a school counselor, Dr. Biles earned her PhD in counseling with an emphasis in counselor education from Oregon State in 2004. She has developed partnerships with the Central Oregon School District, provides evidence-based school counseling field placements for graduate students, along with continuing education for licensed school counselors. So please welcome Dr. Biles.
Thank you.
To her right is Dr. Steve Farmer. He is an associate clinical professor and program coordinator of the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Masters of Arts program at Northern Arizona University, the North Valley campus in Phoenix. Before coming to Arizona, he was a counselor educator for 5 years at the University of North Texas in Dallas and in Denton. Steve has his PhD in marriage and family therapy from St. Mary's University in San Antonio. He is a licensed professional counselor, a licensed marriage and family therapist in Arizona, so please welcome Steve. To his right is Dr. Danica Hayes. She is a professor of counselor education and the executive associate dean of counselor education at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She earned a doctorate in counselor education and supervision with an emphasis in multicultural research from Georgia State University. Her research interests include qualitative methodology, assessment and diagnosis, trauma and gender issues, and multicultural and social justice concerns in counselor preparation and community health. Please welcome Dr. Hayes. To her right is Dr. Vong Ratz. Did I say it right? Ratz, sorry. Is an associate professor of counseling at Seattle University and a licensed mental health counselor. Dr. Ratz received his PhD in counseling from Oregon State University. He has 2 major lines of research, the LGBTIQ and minority health disparities, and multicultural and social justice competent care. He has published in various peer-reviewed counseling journals and is the lead author of the book Counseling for Multiculturalism and Social Justice, Integration, Theory, and Application with Dr. Paul Pedersen. Please welcome Dr. Ratz. And finally, we have Dr. Deena Martin. She is a registered psychologist with a doctoral degree in education psychology from the University of Alberta. In addition to being a professor, Deena has held several academic leadership roles with the Masters of Counseling program at City University of Seattle in Edmonton. Prior to coming to City U, Deena taught community rehab and disability studies at an undergraduate level for several years. As a teacher, a leader, a therapist, friend, and neighbor, Deena offers a respectful, mindful, compassion-centered, and nonviolent approach to helping others that blends Western and Eastern psychology. So please welcome Dr. Martin. Okay, so the first 50 minutes, we're here for 80 minutes. Please feel free if you need to get up, do what you need to do. I'm not going to be offended, and I don't think our panel will be offended. So the first 50 minutes, we'll have the dialogue where our panel will be specifically describing their approaches to the topic and dialoguing with one another, and then the remaining 30 minutes, Dr. Dempsey will take over. To begin, panel, could you please describe current approaches to multiculturalism and social justice training and counselor education programs? Now you guys get to arm wrestle.
I was going to say.
Okay.
However you want to.
Well, I'll give a textbook answer. We can start there. I think current approaches are that we've gone through the past really 2 to 3 decades kind of trying to operationalize what multicultural competency is in terms of anything from awareness, knowledge, skills to now awareness, knowledge, skills, and actions, and sort of how do we implement those actions across various levels. So I think intellectually we're sort of talking about strategies and things that we ought to be doing. And not to be sort of a Debbie Downer, but I think in the context of this week, I think it's fair to say that a lot of that gets shaken up, and I don't think that's a bad idea. I think in the past couple years, we've looked at counseling research, and it's quite flawed and quite shallow. So everything that we read about is pretty superficial about, well, here's the technique you can do, and people increase their awareness of this, and that's all fine and dandy, but it really is flawed in a lot of ways, and we can get in a conversation about that. But I think it gives us freedom to say, what are we doing? I mean, I think a lot of people's world is shaken up, frankly. What are we doing? And how do we respond to this? And how are we personally being affected by it? And how is the research that we've been consuming and teaching our students about really related to practice when it's not really coming from practice? So, not to start us on a negative thing, but I think that's important to say that, frankly, I don't know what to tell you is the best way to approach counselor training, and I'm okay with that, especially in this week.
Well, I met someone new at the president's remarks earlier. So we were introducing ourselves, and she asked me what my specialty is. I told her I'd teach in the counseling program. She asked me what my specialty is, and I said, I don't really have one. I have been in a clinical position, not a tenure position, for 10 years now in 2 different universities, and I've always been at like an extended campus. So where there's, where I'm one of sometimes 1, maybe 2 or 3 faculty. So I teach a lot. But then I thought, okay, well, they asked me to be on the multicultural social justice, so that's my specialty today. And that is the class that I've taught probably all 10 years. So it's the class that I feel the most comfortable in. And really just in the last 5 years, it's kind of like clicked that this is something I am integrating throughout the curriculum. And so I'll just share some of the things that I do. And it starts even before students come into the program, as I have conversations with prospective students, and as we do outreach or we do like little information sessions about our program where people can come and learn about our program. And one of the things I do there is share the values of our profession. So I think our latest ethics code did a good job of putting our values kind of like right at the front. And they included social justice, which is great. So I want to give like good informed consent to people who are interested in the program to understand what the profession is. So giving them an idea that social justice and understanding and welcoming diversity are part of who we are as counselors from the beginning. And it certainly is something that we incorporate in the very first semester too, in the intro to clinical mental health counseling class and the ethics class, teaching the advocacy domains. I think that's one piece of literature that's really stood, for the last 20 years. That model and that those competencies, the advocacy competencies. With that class, we look at the advocacy competencies and that model with some case scenarios where they really start to think, where students really start to think of themselves as a professional, more than just in a box, in a room with 2 chairs, counselor-client, and they start to really think about how can I be a professional that thinks and acts outside that box in different ways for the client and for the client's needs. It also happens in the multicultural class, of course, and I think probably the key assignment there that, as much as I like to change things up year after year just for my own variety, this is one that I can't let go of, and that's the cultural genogram. And it's an assignment that I think helps students with that awareness piece. I'm very impressed with students. So many of them come in with a real heart for people who experience discrimination and injustice. And a lot of them come in with some good self-awareness, but this assignment is always something that that really like kicks that up a notch, just in terms of understanding their own history, their own family experience, and then kind of seeing what does that do to their positionality? What does that do to, or what does that say about how they relate to their clients and how they relate to social justice issues, how they're impacted by social justice issues and how they impact those issues as well. So this is an assignment that we do in the multicultural class. I have them do the cultural genogram for them on themselves, but then also on some different characters in from movies or from documentaries and so forth. So they learn that model, and then we revisit it throughout the program too. We have them pull their cultural genogram out every once in a while throughout the program to kind of like see how it speaks to them again in the counseling processes class and in practicum and so forth.
I can build on that if that's okay.
Yeah.
Again, Deena Martin here. I really liked what you were saying about starting right with prospective students about the concept of diversity. As part of our intake process at our university, we actually have students do a case study before participating in a group interview. And in the group interview, we set the tone of diversity, ethics, and some of the other competencies that we're looking for in our students, or we're hoping to develop as they go through the program. Like you said, we have special coursework on multicultural issues and diversity, ethics. We spend a lot of time talking about power. When I think about ethics, I teach the ethics course. I've been teaching it for about 15 years. There's conflict within the code, right? Our code in Canada is very similar to the American code in that there's respect for the autonomy and dignity of persons, responsible caring, integrity in relationships, and responsibility to society. Ours are actually weighted in that one supersedes number 4 if you are to come into an ethical dilemma. So there's a lot of similarities, but there's subtle differences. Our code is currently being rewritten in Canada. There's a draft copy of it available in the Canadian Psychological Association. And so we've added the language to the individual and peoples, or their culture. So recognizing as psychologists, which is the framework that I work in, that recognizing the social cultural structure that the person comes from becomes part of our case conceptualization when approaching ethics. So our students do 2 years of coursework, then we have some other opportunities for them to demonstrate their learning. We have a comprehensive examination before our students go out to work with the public, if you will, and they're expected to demonstrate competencies in the area of diversity and ethics through case studies. And then when our students are in the field, in their internship, they're actually evaluated on their sensitivity to diversity, social justice issues, and as well as several other competencies. At the end of our program, our students do research, and I would, it's definitely not an exact figure, but I would bet 70% of our research projects that come out of the Edmonton office often have a social justice and advocacy piece to it. So when I was invited to look at and to reflect on these things, I can't tell you that there's a document that says this is what we do from a social justice perspective, but looking back, I could see how it's woven throughout the curriculum and throughout the supporting of our students. The one last thing, and then I'll pass it along, that came out in my reflections of social justice in our program is who's coming into our program? What are our students bringing to the table before they enter? And so many of our students come from applied degrees, child, youth, and counselor education, so they come in with a sensitivity already and a training. Some of our students come from pure psychology, so they've literally been in labs. And so it's been really interesting to see who they are before they arrive and their sensitivities and their education influences how they respond to the social justice conversations that emerge. And, you know, having been there for 8-9 years now, knowing where that ends up in employment outcomes, right? So, thank you.
So I'm going to jump in because I completely forgot in terms of just starting the process on interview day. On our website, we talk about Drive, and I didn't make that up. Vong knows about Drive. Faculty from our program at OSU developed Drive, which is dignity, respect, equality, value, integrity. I did that backwards. I'm a little nervous. And so students come to the program already having a sense that we're going to look at social justice, and we talk about Drive and how that is important to us as faculty throughout the entire program, starting from interview day. And when we do interview day, we're actually looking for a new movie, so if anybody's got an idea, but the group portion of our interview day, we have them watch a movie before they come to interview day. And the movie we've been watching is The Whale Rider, which is getting old, but it's still relevant. And then so when they do their group process, and we as interviewers are watching, they have a set of questions to talk about in terms of how they pull away the multicultural aspect and what's happening in the culture and in that movie. And we get to watch them have this dialogue about their concepts of that movie. And we get to see and hear their impression, where their foundation is around multicultural counseling and things like that. We continue throughout the program. You know, I was reflecting on how do we infuse it. I think we, as our faculty, we talk about how are our classes aligned and how do they work together in that alignment. So from the very beginning, this term is their second term for the first year students. They have social cultural perspectives, which is about oppression, social justice, and advocacy. And it's always fun, depending on what's going on in the political climate, and it's been an amazingly challenging time this term for everyone. But they do that advocacy project, and they have to go out and find whether it's the population or whatever. This time I did it a little different in terms of I wanted them to say, okay, I'm going to do something on racism and really look at what is racism, where is that in our community. We also align, so the coursework where their students are also taking ethics at the same time and group. So they're really getting to be able to talk about those different aspects the whole term in all of their different classes. And I think that happens throughout the classes. So for my students, we're in Central Oregon, if anybody's familiar with Oregon. As one of my students said this year, a couple weeks ago, Oregon is not white by accident. And we look at the history of Oregon and why we are predominantly white in Oregon. And it just starts so many conversations. And so they look at the advocacy piece. Many of my students are from Central Oregon and have never been anywhere else. So, but I have a great group of students. I have many students who come from other states and have been around the world. So it's such a nice dynamic process to have all these students come together. One of the things I've been fortunate to add is taking my students out of Oregon. And so I have joined with Carol Daher and some other faculty from around the country, and we do a week-long diversity immersion. Tina from PSU attends. And some of my school counseling students who go to that, again, have never left Central Oregon. And it's amazing their experience when they really get to take what they're learning and reading and discussing and being able to go out and apply it. And not just in the counseling setting, because I think it's so much more than just being a counselor and a client.
Where do you go?
we go to New York City.
Oh.
And we ride subways. I think our biggest learnings are on the subways. I think the first time I went, and the group of students who went, the one student, every year there are probably a couple, at least 2 people who've never been out of Central Oregon. And they really push themselves to be in New York City. And I think the first time, the one student put her purse between her feet on the store when trying something on in the store, and looked down, and that purse was gone that quick. And it colored her whole experience. But we got to work through that. One of the things we did, and this is getting off topic, so I'm going to move, but we went to the police station in New York City, and it was very interesting. That was an eye-opening experience because seeing the posters on the wall and who those pictures are mostly on the wall did not look like us. And then having the police take her statement, but in that statement, they must have asked her the same question every different way to make sure that she was not making up the story or that, and for her to go, I'm being treated like this. It was an eye-opening experience, and we got to talk about it as a group. So I think that having those hands-on, out in the world experiences that apply what we're teaching in the classroom that's important for us anyway. So. Okay.
Yeah, I like how you bring the classroom out to the community. You know, when I think about teaching about multiculturalism and social justice, I kind of want to add to what Danica shared, which is I think it's so important more than ever before, especially given in light of what's happened in the elections. I had class Wednesday night, it was a theories class, and I struggled all day thinking, should I just lecture or should I just talk about what happened with students? And so I said to myself, well, one, I stayed home all day. You know, I didn't feel comfortable being out in the community. And so I went to class and I said to myself, I'm just going to play it by ear. And as I was getting ready for class, I was listening to conversations. You know how you listen to students talk? And they were talking about the elections. They were asking each other, how are you doing? You know. So right there and then I decided, I'm not going to lecture, we're just going to talk. And we got in a circle. And I guess I share this because I think you have to bring what's happening in the world into the classroom. When you teach about multiculturalism and social justice, you know, you can't make it a completely intellectual endeavor because then it doesn't have much meaning. Concepts and theories are helpful because they provide a schema from which to work, but when you're able to talk about it from your own life, it takes on a different form and shape. And so as we were going around talking, this is what I was hearing from students. I'm scared. And these are students in marginalized communities. I live with fear. One student said she had to medicate herself to get to class. I feel unsafe. I lack hope. And one thing we talked about was, you know, it's hard to be of service to others as counselors when you yourself aren't balanced, right? That's a hard place to be. That's a hard place to operate when you're trying to figure out what's going on with you in light of what's happening in the midst of the elections and trying to help other people. So we talked about the importance of connectedness from relational cultural theory, and just I asked them, are there people in your life, in spaces that you can go to where you feel safe, where you feel connected? And so I think when you teach about multiculturalism and social justice, I think part of it is trying to make the curriculum come to life for them in their very own way. And the other thing I noticed when we were talking was the elections impacted students differently based on their identities. Somalian students said, I'm afraid because I fear being deported. I don't know if I can bring my family over before January hits, right? We've been working on the paperwork, and I don't know if it's going to happen. We have a transgender student in the classroom who started looking for all his medical documents, worried that something was going to happen to him, right? White male student, said, I feel for everybody, but I also know my life's not going to change every day, and so that struck me. And so what struck me about it is when you teach about multiculturalism and social justice, I think part of it is understanding who your students are, right, and how that's going to impact them differently. In other words, when you teach multiculturalism and social justice to white males, heterosexual males, right, they need to learn different things than when you teach students of color about multiculturalism and social justice, because they have different, they're coming from different places, positions of power, if you will. And so I think that's a challenge when we talk about how do we integrate it into the classroom. And in terms of, I find it more challenging to teach about it than anything else. For example, our program does a really good job of preparing students clinically, but not necessarily preparing them with advocacy skills. I think that's the challenge as we move forward, which is helping students determine whether to work with a client in the office or out in the community, and how to make that distinction week in and week out with clients. I like what some of the people have shared in terms of we need to be more systemic in terms of how we integrate multiculturalism and social justice into our program from the beginning to the very end. And I think it's also important when you think about integrating it into the curriculum that you have buy-in from all your faculty, right? It's not as powerful if you're one of 6 that teaches about multiculturalism and social justice as it is if you have all 6 of you all on board. And the other thing that comes up to me for me is when you teach about it, you're really telling students to question things. And sometimes that means they questioning you.
Yes. Amen.
Wait a minute.
Yeah, and sometimes I find myself going, okay, wait, I didn't mean that, right? But being open to it is really important. And then the last thing I'll share is that the challenging thing about teaching about multiculturalism and social justice is, and in particular social justice, is we ourselves weren't, I myself wasn't trained in it. It's the same thing that's happened in the 70s and 80s when the field was talking about preparing counselors to be multiculturally competent. You had counselor educators and counseling psychologists trying to prepare students to be multiculturally competent when they themselves didn't receive that training. We're trying to do the same thing around social justice, right? When we ourselves, I didn't get that in my master's program, and so it required me to kind of go out to different disciplines to learn about social justice theories and models and stuff like that and try to integrate it. And that's, I think, one of the challenges is how do we do that when we ourselves haven't been trained in it and integrated in the classroom.
And can I add
Yep.
to that? The training doesn't stop. I'm continually challenging my own knowledge, skills, and attitude. So I think it's an ongoing process.
We kind of started down the road to kind of the next prompt of just how do we enhance multicultural and social justice training across the curriculum. Do any of the other panelists have, kind of what we need to do for the future in order to really have competent students both in multiculturalism and in social justice?
Well, I appreciate everyone sharing techniques, and these are things that I've done to sort of facilitate social justice awareness. The reality is a lot of the country isn't surrounded by progressive pockets. A lot of the country have relatives and friends that aren't progressive, how you want to, then maybe they define progressive differently. But I think there's and not to make this all about the election, but I think it's such an important point for us to just push the brakes for a second. Because I can tell you all sorts of things that we should be doing across the curriculum, but the reality is, if we look at our environments, people around us aren't being intentional social justice advocates. Our communities aren't. So what are we doing wrong? Mm-hmm. Because if we're training folks to say, okay, African Americans are like this, or white people are like this, and they've been marginalized, and these are the oppression experiences, those things are important. But if we don't ever turn the gaze around and say, what are you doing to perpetuate isms in terms of not speaking up, not challenging your own cognitive dissonance around things, this is the time, I think, to do that. Because right now I'm pretty, and I'm on tape so I won't curse, but I'm pretty frustrated with my fellow Americans, frankly. And it's hard for me to train counselors and say, you know what, you need to be sensitive to this. No, you need to go out and whip some butt, right? And like get to know your local community. And going back to kind of connecting back to the community, how many of our students really understand the local community, the percentages of the population that are disproportionately impacted in various ways? What percentage of folks are homeless for mental, I mean, how do you know your communities? And starting there instead of maybe some esoteric conversation about what groups are about. And I just, you know, I'm challenging myself to do that. And my teaching and my writing and all of that, like, none of this matters when I wake up Wednesday morning and people I thought were sensitive people aren't. So sorry to be the downer for the panel, but this is kind of where I am.
That's where I am. I mean, that's where we're at.
I mean, I appreciate the great things we're doing, but I mean, frankly, we're in academic bubbles, and a lot of us are in very blue dots of the country. And so how do we, you know, as a Southern-born person who's moved a lot, you know, it's like, that ain't reality. And it's not just the South, and it sure isn't white males. So it's whites for sure, but it's not just white males, and they're not from the South, and they're not college or not college educated. It's everyone. And so where did we mess up?
I think you're talking about, do our students know their community?
Right.
That's been a big one for me just since I've moved to Arizona, which is just 4 years. I'm still getting to know Phoenix and Arizona in general. And so one of the techniques that has changed in my multicultural class, you know, I think the assignment that almost everyone has in their multicultural class is to go out and have a multicultural experience. Right. And so, you know, I'll go to the Greek festival and I'll have some baklava and Greek beer, and then come back and journal about it. So I've really changed. I still have the assignment, but I really kind of like am a little bit more directive to have people engage in whatever activity that they do. And I'm starting to, as I learn the community myself, help students think about what's really going to challenge them personally, and how can they be in a situation where they are engaging with people who are different from them. I've also just begun, and this is something I'm challenging myself to do, is getting involved in my community and encouraging students to do the same. So we have a legislator in our state who runs the African American Concerns Council for the state, and they have been having town hall meetings in different cities throughout the state. Phoenix has been very good as a police department. There have been some unfortunate incidents throughout the years in Phoenix, but as a department, as a city, they've worked to really make the police and the community come together. So the town hall meetings have been around that, and so I'm wanting to get students, this is something I'm wanting to do and endeavor to do, getting students more involved with some of those local organizations like Black Lives Matter and these town hall meetings that have been kind of facilitated by the United Church of Christ in the community, that's getting community people together, legislators, citizens, police. That I think is a place where students can really kind of see what's happening in their community.
When you think like that, along those lines, how do you differentiate between a counselor and then a social worker? Where are you drawing the lines if they need to be drawn?
I think it's going to depend kind of on where they end up in their work and in their setting, and the clients that they work with and what they're called to do. But in terms of identity, professional identity, I think this is definitely a part of our counseling profession's identity. And so, they may be doing what we used to typically call case management, but
I don't mean to put you on the spot, sorry.
No. I think it's definitely our work as well. I remember my very first job in a elementary school doing program stuff during the summer, and it was like everything I was doing was case management, and I was like, I am not a social worker. I am a counselor, and this is like my first year, and I learned real quick that counseling involves that kind of work.
Yeah, I have when you ask that question, what comes to mind is, in terms of the difference between social work and counseling, and that's that counselors, do social justice work, and it's based from their counseling work, in the sense of we hear things from clients, and that calls us to want to do something more, right? And social workers do clinical work based on their community-based work, right? And they realize, oh, this person needs individual care, and so I'm going to provide one-on-one help. I think what's interesting is when I talk to social workers, right, there's no disagreement among social workers about the need to do clinical-based work. That's not even a question, because they realize when they do one-on-one work, clinical-based work, it helps them in the community and vice versa. But when I talk to counselors and counselor educators and counseling psychologists, there's not 100% agreement about doing community-based work, right? It's always, well, that's other people's work. It's not counseling, it's not psychology. And I find that interesting, and I think part of it is just because of how people are trained.
Yeah.
In particular, so. But my experience has been, I've never had a client ask me, are you a counselor or a social worker? Right. What clients tend to ask is, can you help me get at the root of my problem? They don't say it like that, but that's kind of what they're asking. And I think it's our role to figure out, is the root of that problem in the person or in the environment? If it's in the environment, then we need to focus on changing the environment versus changing the person to adapt to the environment. And so I think that's what clients want, but they don't always ask it in that way. And it's our role to help decipher with them where their problem's rooted in. And I think it's also our role to educate clients that we can do this work, right? In other words, in the very first session, it's talking about what our roles are, and that includes I can work one-on-one with you, or I can work in the community with you. We might do a combination, right? And informing them and educating them, this is what counseling can potentially be. But I don't think counselors do that, and so therefore clients don't always ask that.
Thank you.
So I don't really think it matters if you're a counselor or a social worker or a psychologist. At the end of the day, I totally agree with that. I think what matters is what affects every profession, right? Why aren't people coming to counseling? Why isn't it for them? Why isn't it accessible to them? Or why aren't they coming to, a psychologist, whatever the field, in terms of looking at that? Because I think social justice, the more we engage with it in terms of at the client level all the way to the community level, it only strengthens our professional identity. But the reality is our professional identities are merging. We don't live in discipline silos. And so I think a lot of our attention has been around sort of retaining a strong counselor identity, and we've kind of gone, internal with that instead of looking at, we forgot about the clients we're trying to serve, and they aren't going to come to us in our traditional sort of format. So, and to be optimistic, I think we are doing things. We are getting out in the community, right?
Yeah.
But we're still spending a lot of time focusing on how am I different from a social worker? Well, you know what? My university is a half a mile from 3 elementary schools that live in daily, weekly hotels that don't go to school, after the first week of school, and they don't care, right? So I think we need to sort of goes back to getting to know your local community and how are we all in this together in terms of making it more accessible, removing some of those kind of attitudinal or structural factors that prevent people from seeking help. So.
It's more how we collaborate
Right, it
with
really
each other
is.
and use the resources wisely, because at the end of the day, we're all wanting to make an impact on our clients and on our schools and our communities.
And it's not just our relationships among helping professions, it's how we sort of relate to managed care and reimbursement and access to clients. And we have to sort of think, how do we work the system to help our clients versus trying to get in a fight with the social workers? Not that we're doing that, but I think our questions change.
Getting away from the turf wars.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Any last thoughts or comments? Because we are at.
I was going to say, the only thing I would like to add is I liked your comment earlier, Vaughn, about being intellectual and how do we get to sort of the heart at times. And so one of the biggest things I've done over the last 2 years is integrated poetry and music and art into, first 5 minutes of class and last 5 minutes of class, and just bringing other voices into the classroom on a daily basis. Students anticipated, whose poem are we reading today, and just having that human experience of connection to help alleviate. I realize I'm from Canada and it's different up here politically a bit. I'm from Alberta. I don't know if you know what's going on up here. But there's that tender spot of the shared humanity of across cultures and generations and geographical lines.
I just have to say I'm appreciating the poetry on your buildings and throughout this community. I spent the day walking around yesterday, and there's poetry everywhere. And I'm thinking, wow, Canadians really like their poetry.
I think there's a person, Mark Gonzalez, in Times of Terror, Wage Beauty. And it's definitely a book worth reading if you.
And we're all going to miss Leonard Cohen.
Oh, please, yes, thank you.
Okay, so my esteemed colleague, I'm turning it to you for the questions. Yeah.
Okay. As we have this discussion and questions come up, I encourage you to jot them down, and it's not too late, and we can continue having this discussion. Okay, first question. As an educator in training, and Dr. Ratch, you kind of talked about this, so I want to direct this to you and other folks. If the spirit hits you, just jump on in. As an educator in training, I struggle to tease apart my roles as an instructor, a counselor, supervisor. In teaching our diversity class, I feel a strong pull to attend to the dynamics of the room with students, defensiveness, microaggressions, parallel process. How do I manage? How do I manage? The real stuff that's in the room, it's represented in the room, is in our world. Do we ignore that? How do we do that? Dr. Ratch, jump in.
Well, I don't know if I can say how do we do it, but I can tell you how I did it. And for me, it was a process in terms of when I graduated, I realized real quickly that I was ill-equipped to manage these discussions in the classroom because my training didn't really prepare me for it. It prepared me to work individually, but not necessarily to have these discussions in the classroom. And so I sought a lot of training outside my program. Went to a lot of conferences, immersed myself in the community, and through that I was able to develop, I think, skills over the years in terms of how to manage and have discussions around social justice in the classroom, how to use students to get them to connect with each other. You know, sometimes a trick I've learned is when students ask something and I don't know the answer, I always throw it back to the class. What do others think? And what that allows me to do is kind of process as they're sharing. But the other thing I realize is, as in my role is really in the classroom to make sure things are safe, or people are safe. Not necessarily comfortable, right? And make that distinction, because there's learning that comes through discomfort. At least I think so. And so with that in mind, you know, I know that I have a different role. I have an agenda, but I also have a different role when I'm in the classroom. And so sometimes when the student says something or is in denial or says something that's controversial or whatever, I always try to gauge other students, right? And I'll say, what do other people think? Or does somebody else have a different perspective than that, right? And that helps sometimes because it helps in terms of that other student can at least feel safe with me, right? Knowing that there's times where I put my foot down, you know, and I say that's not okay. And I know there's consequences with that. I mean, I was looking at my teaching evals, and the teaching evals for the Multicultural and Social Justice course tend to be lower than my other courses. And I think it's because the discomfort students experience. And so I think not worrying about one's teaching evals is important, because that allows you to attend to what's going on in the classroom more so. And I think you're able to do that if you have support of your dean, of your chair, to say, I understand, this is kind of what you're trying to do. I also think it's hard, you know, especially as a person of color, to teach about it, because for me it's emotionally draining. I walk away from class sometimes and I'm either on a high or on a low, you know, and sometimes I don't want to do it anymore. And so I try to find ways to regroup, ways to get connected with other people. And the other thing I have to be mindful of is having conversations outside of class, and in particular with students of color, who say, can you believe that happened in the classroom? You know, and so I try to be mindful of being professional in those discussions and trying to bring it back and say, why don't you bring that up in the class next week? You know, I'm not always perfect in it, you know, because sometimes it's a hard thing. But I try to collaborate and use students to engage in that discussion. So that's kind of what I do.
Okay, okay. Anybody else on the panel?
I think just really similar, using the students. I'm finding that it's the students who sometimes really want a challenge that don't dare speak up. And so I'll get the emails on the side. It was very amazing, that one email I got this term that's just really incredible, and you know, accusing me of my agenda. And so going back and having a discussion with that student and just saying, you know, if you're feeling this way or thinking this way, there are other people in the class feeling and thinking this way, and it's about hearing all sides and being able to have and challenge one another. So I'm just building on that, and it's uncomfortable for me, and I'm gonna still I just don't sleep that night after class. I just know that. But,
Sister Deena,
yeah, but it's
I'm
really
sorry.
challenging them.
Sister Deena, I see you're ready to jump out your seat. I got to know what you're going to say. Talk to me.
For me, world events is really important, and sometimes it's creating space for discussion, and sometimes it's just creating space for silence to honor what has happened. It's not something that we can respond to in every class, but I was recently at a silent retreat for 10 days, and we were coming out of it, and the leader said, as we were doing our closing circle, I need you to know that nothing has happened while we've been in retreat. And I remember going, okay. And one of the other retreatants had been there when there was the bombing at the Boston Marathon. And so just realizing that those events are in my classroom every day, and so creating space either before class or at the end of class to respond to them, whether it's family members that are being affected by the bombings, or whether it's the racial experiences that they might have when they leave the safety of the classroom, hopefully the safety of the classroom. Thank you.
Okay.
I think when I first started teaching, it was more like an experience of fear or terror, and I was, hiding behind the podium and my PowerPoints. And it's only as, I've been doing this for 10 years now, that each year I'm feeling more and more open with my students, and coming out of the closet more and more, and sharing myself more. So I've done the cultural genogram assignment, and I shared a lot of that with my students. And part of it is being at this extended campus and being with a cohort, so that I teach these students 2 classes a semester, and then I'm with them for 2 years. So what that has done is it's freed me up to be more of a supervisor and sometimes a counselor, or to wear those hats with those students, and to recognize that I want to practice what I preach, that personal development and professional development go hand in hand, and to not be so afraid of, I'm still afraid when students challenge me, yeah, I'm still afraid, but not to be so afraid about that, to have those difficult conversations, and to share my own experience as a white guy from the Midwest, who's gay and who still has to deal with his whiteness and his guyness and his gayness, and in all of my relationships. And
nice. Sister Danica, you were on fire a little earlier, and I got a fiery question for you. I appreciate you mentioning the election. It shows how disconnected we are from our neighbors. Why are we shocked that Trump won? When I query my international friends, they laugh at us because they say, why are you all the last to know? And make it relate to counseling, but I just...
Part of that, why are we what?
Why are we the last to know?
Why are we the last? So I think this goes back to kind of what I was saying. We've been in our intellectual bubble about what multicultural competency is, what skills we think counselors need to have, what attitudes they need to have. We've been ignoring anger. We've been ignoring very misplaced anger towards other groups, and we've been writing it off as, oh, those are just racist, sexist, homophobic people that I'm not going to deal with. I'm very guilty of that. Like, I don't need those people in my life, right? I have my safe bubble of progressive people. And I think as counselors and counselor educators, we think we can sort of isolate ourselves out from that, right? And so why did he win? Because we dismissed a large portion of the population, 49% to be frank, right? And I think, to try to relate it to counseling here, I think it brings me back to basic things like cultural identity models that we teach our students about, right? We say at like level 2, you have cognitive dissonance, and then you work through that, and then you're perfect, right, by stage 5 and 6. But I think these election results and interactions we're having with family and friends and colleagues about how can you possibly think this way, right? this is a cognitive dissonance, and I think counselor educators think they're really high in their racial identity status. I mean, I think I'm, you know, a feminist. I think I'm, but you know what? I'm fucking pissed off right now, you know? And I'm like, this is cognitive dissonance. And I think this is just shows the complexity of what we're trying to teach, and the fact that you can't write off people just because you don't like what they have to say. It works both ways. And I think we have to do a better job in training of sort of addressing that dissonance as normal. It's cyclical, it works both ways, and talking about that at the beginning and continuing to cycle through it as we talk through it.
Danica, the next time I ask you a question, I want you to tell me how you really feel.
Okay.
All right?
I'll try not to curse. I really was trying my best.
This morning I was having a discussion with Dr. Ratz, and I was saying, okay, did your institution send out any kind of information about the election? And he was saying, no, folks kind of stay away from that because it's political. So this next question, how do we do social justice work when at times it's very political? And how can we do it without alienating some students, not including them in the conversation, yet understanding that this is stuff that's happening in our world and affecting the very people that will come in for counseling? How do we do that? Do we have that conversation? Talk to me.
Our work, social justice work, is political. There's no way around it. And I'm at a state university. I don't get into party politics in our conversations, but I do get into issues politics, because all of the issues, all of the social justice issues that we're concerned about in terms of marginalization and criminalization and incarceration of black men, and income and wealth inequality, they're all political issues, and they're all social justice issues. So they definitely concern us, but that doesn't mean we have to get into party politics. I mean, I don't get into party politics. That's, I guess, where I make the difference.
Okay, other folks.
So, yeah, we may not, like, I may not think that I'm getting into party politics, but challenging
In the classroom discussion,
the
I don't,
issues
but, yeah.
and stuff like that. And there are students that see or believe that I am getting into party politics. And so bringing that out in the light and saying, okay, it's not about being right or wrong, or one is better than the other. It's about how do we dialogue and come to a new understanding collectively, or that I'm not here to change your mind, you're not here to change my mind, because that's not what's going to happen. But how do we talk about it and come to a different and new understanding of what's happening? And I have had to say this term to my students, you know, you may think that I'm being liberal, or you may think that I'm talking about social justice and humanity. It's about humanity and human rights. And so helping them see that, I think, is important, because otherwise they do just assume that we are talking party politics. And that's part of that education, I think.
Yeah, I think you have to be comfortable around being political, right? Because social justice inevitably is a value-laden process. And so I think one of the things we can do in our programs is stop teaching students to be neutral. You know, teach them how to be human in sessions. Teach them how to engage in conversations about race, gender, sexual orientation in session, just the way we teach them how to engage in conversations about domestic violence, about substance abuse, right? Teach them that they have to initiate those conversations, and that clients won't come in saying, I'm a victim of racism, right? But teach them how to ask those questions. Could what you're experiencing be racism? Because I heard this, this, and this, and this. Just as we teach them to hypothesize whether or not that person is an addict, right? We give them the tools to ask those questions. I can't help but wonder if you have an addiction because of this, this, and this. We need to do that same thing around multicultural and social justice issues. And so to do that, we have to move away from teaching them about being neutral. Right? Katz wrote about that in 1985, counseling is a socio-political process. And by teaching them to be neutral, we're not really preparing them to work with the realities of their world, and their world is our clients. In terms of alienating, you know, I think we have to be comfortable with knowing that we're going to alienate certain types of people, or maybe not certain types of people, but some students, if that makes sense. And I share that to say, not everyone's on board with social justice, right? Not everyone's on board with multiculturalism. And if you're not on board, you're going to feel alienated. And I think that goes back to being really conscious and intentional about who you bring into your program. Now, I know just saying that is controversial, right? We want to accept everybody. But I believe that not everybody can do counseling.
Dr. Retz, let me push back. Are we alienating them, or we're gatekeepers, correct?
Yep.
I mean, we have an ethical responsibility. So are we really alienating, or are we gatekeeping?
I think we're gatekeepers.
Okay.
Right? But I think people do feel alienated.
They feel alienated, absolutely.
You know, and so in the admissions process, what you look for is, does this person have potential to promote multiculturalism and social justice? Right? And that's hard to gauge, because people can talk a good game, right? And so sometimes you look for what have they done, because sometimes past behavior is an indication of future behavior, if that makes sense. And so I remember one person applied to our program. We're a Catholic Jesuit university, and she had said in the admissions process, if a person came to me and wanted an abortion, I couldn't work with that person. And then my follow-up was, well, would you be able to refer that person? And that person said, I couldn't, because that's against my faith. That told me right there, this person might not be a fit for our program. Because what we teach is to provide students or clients with resources, regardless of your value system. My guess is she probably felt alienated, alone. You know, and so I think to go back to, you know, when you look at your programs, it's really looking at what's the outcome you want? What do you want graduates to be able to do after they graduate? You know, and for me, it's I want them to be change agents. I want them to change the world. I want them to change their community. But not everybody has that belief, and so they would be in our program.
You talk about change, and sometimes before we try to make that change, my goodness, we have to make change within our own faculty. Here, another hot one. How have you contributed to gaining faculty buy-in? My colleagues don't seem to dive into their own stuff, especially as it relates to our students. I'm not sure how we can promote multicultural, social justice. I can't do it alone. Y'all talk about it.
Yeah, I was finding it interesting because it's kind of like I've not looked at what the research says or any of the studies, but I do wonder if, you know, I talked to some of my social justice minded colleagues across the country, and we always wonder what would it be like if we were all working in the same department. You know, it'd be scary. I think it's hard when you're by yourself, you know, in a program.
Danica, talk to me.
Well, I'm a member of the dark side as a dean's office person, so I can kind of talk from, you know, sometimes I think establishing a shared vision, all of that works. A lot of times I don't think it does, because you're going to have folks that don't buy into, okay, our program is a social justice program. I think it's the same thing that we have to do sort of with students and maybe even in our personal lives, to kind of call out, you know, that dissonance is normal, that these are barriers to why people don't want to engage in it. I mean, there's research on this. I mean, Sue talks about Race Talk in 2013. It talks about the barriers of why we don't talk about race. I think looking at some of that literature about what are the costs for engaging and not engaging in this kind of discussion, what are the barriers? Todd Abrams does work on white dialectics. I think is really useful to look at other things. But just saying, you know what, we're not all there yet, and we may not always be there. These barriers may cycle through. But I think shoving it down someone's throat that we're going to be this way because social justice is important is never going to work. I think to say, you know, I hear you, I don't agree with you. A lot of people sort of may feel that way because of X, Y, and Z, but you know, long term, these are sort of the costs, and you know, we're here for our students, et cetera. I think it's more of a bottom-up discussion versus a top-down, let's become a mission. And I know people may disagree with that you need to have a social justice mission, and you know, but the fact is you're going to have tenured faculty you work with that they aren't going anywhere, even as much as you wish. They're not going to go anywhere. And so how do you sort of deal with it? It's how you deal with it in your normal life.
And they're not going to change their line of research
And
to
they're not going to change their line of
coincide
research.
with
And you know
your
what?
mission.
Who am I to say that they need to do that, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, that's just not how the world works. But how do we sort of acknowledge their position, acknowledge the barriers that might be underlying those positions, and go from there,
Yeah.
right?
You say, how do we deal with it, how we do in our normal life. And some folks have learned to be silent, to be safe. Talk about that.
Well, I'm knocking on the door of 50, so I just feel more brave, I guess, or less scared. I guess I feel less scared in my life, and I think that translates in the classroom, and it translates in my relationships with students, and in my relationship with fellow faculty. I've been blessed with this particular question. I don't have. I've always had very supportive departments that I've worked in. So I haven't felt like I've been in a place where I'm alone or need to try and convince other people of something in terms of faculty within the department. But I guess, just what I shared before in terms of just my own experience, personal experience of wanting to be more open in the classroom and in my teaching and in my relationships with students.
Yeah.
And I think we have to be aware of our colleagues that are quote unquote marginalized, and I hate that word because it's just not a good word. But how can we sort of stand up for them as we need to? But I think just basic things. I mean, as a woman, I hear a sexist comment or whatever. It's like, I need to be able to say, I don't feel safe. I want to have a relationship with you. I want to engage in conversations. I don't feel safe, and this is why. And I know it's hard for people to get there, especially if they're not tenured and, they're dealing with the old white boys network. A lot of universities are still like that. I'm sorry to my fellow white males, but that's the reality. We look at percentages of diverse faculty and female faculty that are associate and full professors and so forth. But I think it is on us to speak up for our colleagues, but also if we find ourselves in situations, as much as we can say, just say, I just don't feel very safe right now, but I want to have a relationship with you, and I want to understand you, and I want you to understand me.
Yeah.
And some of us are not tenured,
Yeah.
and we're on a year-to-year contract.
Yeah.
And it still means that if we need to speak up, it's that, going back to that, there is no neutral.
Right.
And so we have to speak up. And it may not go anywhere. I don't have the power. I'm not, but I still can speak up.
Yeah. So as you all talked about teaching the multicultural classes, you talked about being vulnerable in the classroom. So not only are you vulnerable in the classroom, you have to be vulnerable with your faculty as well, and advocates in the school that you work for. Wow. Deep stuff. deep stuff. Okay, one more question. As an instructor of color working with white students, how would you suggest I address white privilege, microaggressions? Students tend to close up and be very defensive. What are your tricks?
Maybe I'll start with that one. Coming from Edmonton, Alberta, there's a lot of white shame around how we've worked with individuals of Aboriginal descent. And so obviously I'm not somebody of color or can speak to that from that experience, but I can speak to the idea of starting with belonging. I've worked on lots of inclusivity and racism, diversity training programs at a corporate level and in education. And when we other, and I know you guys know this, right? It just creates more polarization. And so starting the conversation with belonging and to me has been helpful in terms of creating safety around bringing forward the questions.
Dr. Ratz, I just noticed that your name was at the bottom of this question, so.
I'm happy to hand it over.
I think for me, what I do is try to tell students it's not their fault, right? Because when you teach about white privilege and racism, what I notice is white students in particular feel really guilty. They feel shame, they feel embarrassed. And so I help them to understand it's not their fault they were born white. It's not their fault that they were taught to believe certain things. But now that they know, what do they do with it? So I think that's important. I think the other thing that's important is when you talk about racism in classes, students of color talk about it from a different place than white students. White students talk about it from a place of, I'm an individual. Students of color talk about it as, I'm a part of a social group, racial group. And so part of it is helping white students to be able to put on that lens of, I'm a part of a white race. And for a lot of students, that's really new, and that's scary to look at the world through that lens. They've looked through the world, some have looked through the world through the ethnic lens. I'm Italian, I'm Swedish, but not necessarily through the white lens. And so I think what's hard about teaching about racism in courses is you only have a certain amount of weeks, right? And we're a quarter system, so it's 11 weeks. And my journey around racism and understanding it is a lifelong process. And so I think that's hard, is how do you instill in students the knowledge and skills and awareness they need that will equip them so that way later on, outside of the class, they can kind of continue that. But I think it's just letting them know it's not their fault and getting them to look at themselves as a member of a white race. They're part of a group, I think is really important. Some of the things I've done is I've split students up based on their racial group. Students of color in this group, multiracial, biracial students in this group, and then white students in this group, and they're all in separate rooms. And you hear the students of color, and there's like a lot of energy and laughter in the room as they're talking about what racism means to them. The laughter is from just feeling empowered. And I go to the door where the white students are, and it's like quiet. And I think they need to be able to feel that and be amongst themselves. Because they do it in their community, at least in Seattle, we're very segregated, right? And just having them be conscious of that, they do that themselves, I think is important. And that allows them to recognize they're part of a group, so.
Thank you. Well, I hate to end, but it's got to end sometime. And I have been given the task to kind of sum up this conversation. So I'm going to do my best. Sister Danica started out, and she's talked about 2 to 3 decades with strategy. And she said, wow, what are we doing? What are we doing? We can talk about strategy, but what are we doing? How can we teach practice? when the literature and research doesn't come from practice. And then she really started to get on fire. And she said, you know, we need to look at the isms regarding not what's wrong with you, but how I'm a part of this. Brother Steve talked about teaching, advocacy, multicultural competencies, and that cultural genogram. He talked about how he grappled with, is he a social worker, is he a counselor? But at the very end realizes that he has to do advocacy work. Sister Deena talked about starting social justice conversation early on. Let's not wait till you get to that class right before you graduate. Let's talk about that thing early on. The intake process, through assessment, setting the tone for diversity. The importance of power she talked about. She said there was a conflict with the code. Love it, love it, love it. Sister Kathy talked about drive, dignity, respect, integrity, value, equality. And she talked about that same thing, starting from the very beginning and making sure that the curriculum has all of those things. She said, the student said, Oregon is not white by accident. So understanding our students' worldview and encouraging these students to put themselves in a position to do the work when they have the privilege not to, okay? Brother Vaughn talked about what's going on in the world. And what's going on in the world, we have to bring it into the classroom because what's going on into the world comes in our counseling sessions. Multiculturalism needs to look beyond the concepts and the theories. Teaching the subject means understanding who your students are. I think he just said that. And it just came to me. I just thought about Little House on the Prairie. Yeah, y'all remember Little House on the Prairie? Yeah, okay, all right. Hey, we got some 40s, some above the 40s in here. Hey.
It was one of two shows we were allowed.
Do you remember Little House on the Prairie?
That and
It was like a one-room schoolhouse. And when we teach this stuff, it's kind of like a one-room schoolhouse because we're teaching the same stuff, but we've got to meet everyone where they are. If we were to write a book, I would use a title. I would combine some stuff that Sister Danica said and Sister Kathy said. We've got to move beyond the academics. The training never stops. We've got to move beyond the academics. The training never stops.